Hello and welcome to the very first Empire Watch Live. This is a special edition on the US presidential election and the results are in. Trump has won. So today we are asking the question, what does Trump's return mean for US imperialism and climate chaos? And we've got some very special guests joining us to dissect this. But first, I'm Lleana Chan and my co-host is Fiona Edwards. And we have Martha Stevens, our amazing graphic designer and producer backstage. So she's hopefully we won't be referencing her too much, or she doesn't have to come on. Let's hope that we have no technical difficulties, but she's there anyway to save us. A little bit about Empire Watch. As the US-led global war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south heats up, our mission at Empire Watch is to bring you news, opinions, and analysis to inform the anti-war movement and challenge disinformation and pro-war propaganda. So if you agree with that, please do like, subscribe, and comment. Click the bell for notifications, you know the drill, and support our work on Patreon, link in bio. We have some amazing guests joining us today, and Fiona, take it away. You're going to introduce them.
Thanks, Lleana. Well, we've got some amazing guests joining us. So I'm just going to go through them all now. First of all, we have Anna Chen, who is a pioneering writer, poet, broadcaster. Anna has written for the New Internationalist magazine, the South China Morning Post, Tribune, Morning Star, The Guardian, and she wrote a column for Asia Times as well. She was also a freelance writer and presenter for BBC Radio 4 and Renaissance FM. Welcome, Anna. Secondly, we have Matthew Ho, who is an associate director of the Eisenhower Media Network. Matt is a former Marine Corps captain and a former Afghanistan State Department officer and a disabled Iraq War veteran. In 2009, Matt resigned his post with the State Department in Afghanistan over the escalation of the war by the United States. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Sequoia D'Souza, who is an anti-war and anti-imperialist activist and a commentator. Welcome, Sequoia.
Pleasure to be here, guys.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first ever live. We're just going to get right into it. So obviously Trump has won. I wasn't surprised. I don't know if any of you guys were surprised, but let's look at the election results. Martha's going to pull up a graphic for us. But Trump actually won the popular vote and the electoral college vote, which, a huge, some would say a landslide, some would say that's a slight exaggeration, but he got 72.5 million votes, which is 50.9% of the vote. In 2020, he got 74 million votes. So basically around the same thing. He held on to his coalition this year at 2024. I mean, the bigger news here is that Kamala Harris got 67.8 million votes, or maybe a little bit more now, since they didn't finish counting the votes when we got the statistic out. But she has actually lost 13 million votes for the Democrats is 2020. So that's like a huge margin. I think that's particularly significant. I, of course, was most interested to hear about how Jill Stein was going to do. And she only got over like about 650,000 votes, which is only 0.5% of the popular vote. To give some sort of reference for that, in 2016, she got 1.5 million votes and over 1%. So that's, you know, that's the part that I really want to hear your insight on, Matt. But it's a two-part question because I'm sure people really care about how did Trump win? So what's your, Matt, what's your takeaways on the election results? In your opinion, what brought Trump back to the White House? Your assessment of the Biden-Harris administration and how much of that contributed to his win. And of course, you know, talk about Jill Stein a little bit. I mean, I was hoping that she could get to 5%. Considering the momentum she seemed to have going into the election, why didn't that translate to higher numbers for the Green Party? What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, all good questions, and thank you for having me on you. You know, I think with what happened was the Democrats ran a candidate who was not a good candidate. She's just, you know, in previous elections had not demonstrated the ability of what you would think of a national level candidate. They ran on a platform where many Americans are struggling right now. Over 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. And the Democratic response, every time people would turn on MSNBC or they'd open up the New York Times or the USA Today or whatever, the response would be, well, no, it's not that bad. You just don't really understand economics, right? So there is this separation from what people were experiencing with this talking down, this condensation that was reminiscent, I think, for 2016 of how people were feeling coming out of the Obama years, where they were being told, look at the stock market, look how great the banks have rebounded. At the meantime, everyone had friends and family, it seemed like, who lost a home during that time. And then, of course, there was the issue of Gaza, the issue of the genocide. I mean, if you're going to fund and arm a genocide, you have to be prepared for the consequences. And so even though there's a lot of data out there that showed that if Harris had adopted a stronger stance, if she had said, I will condition arms sales to Israel based upon a ceasefire, that she would have won a lot more votes than she would have lost. And the Democrats knew this, and they chose not to follow that route. For them, it was their calculation was it's more important to stay in the good graces of the Israel lobby than to lose Arab American, Muslim American, and progressive votes in the millions. So I think in a snapshot, we can go more into detail if you want. That's kind of what I see as the three big points of the election. I'd say the corollary to the genocide aspect is that then you also went buddy with Liz Cheney. All right. So you really doubled down on who you were. With regards to, I think Trump ran just a better campaign than Harris. He connected with people. He had essentially a story that people understood, a story of being up against the establishment, being up against the elites. Even though Trump is an elite himself, he's able to distance himself. And people felt heard when Donald Trump was talking. And I mean, however you feel about the man, you have to recognize that his campaigning was very good, and particularly when you juxtapose that to Harris's campaign, which again seemed to talk down to people or to ignore their actual problems. Now, the third party aspect, I think, is really troubling, and I think it's very disappointing for many people who were interested in seeing third parties and independents do better. And I think that those who are involved in independent politics in the U.S. really have to, just as the Democrats need to come out of this election and say, wow, what happened? What do we need? What do we need to do? What can we learn from this? The independents and third parties, because it wasn't just the Greens that underperformed, the Libertarians underperformed, very badly. You mentioned that Stein got about 650,000 votes this election. In 2016, she got 1.5 million. Well, Chase Oliver, I think the Libertarian candidate, who's also an anti-war candidate, he got 500,000 votes. And in 2016, Gary Johnson got 4.5 million votes for the Libertarians. The Libertarians really underperformed in a way the Greens did as well. A lot of this has to do with people voting out of hate and fear for either Harris or Trump. And that tends to drive people away from independent choices. But a lot's got to do with money. And how can people know about choices if you're not able to get them in front of them? But I mean, a lot to we can go into in that as well, as terms of the disappointment of the third party candidates, particularly the anti-war candidates, because if you're not going to perform well in an election where you've got two of the most unfavorable, disliked candidates of all time running atop the incredibly disliked Democratic and Republican parties who are carrying out a genocide, and your anti-war candidates barely break 1 million votes total combined in the election, there's got to be some real soul searching and some really hard questions to be asked.
Well, thanks very much for that insights there, Matt. I want to focus on element of Trump's campaigning, which is basically really been a key way in which he's built his base, which is to run incredibly racist, misogynistic, bigoted election campaigns. And I'm just going to show now an infamous clip that made waves just before the election. So just going to show a clip now.
Like, I don't know if you guys know this, but there's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah. I think it's called Puerto Rico.
Right.
So, this rhetoric from a so-called comedian, it's really quite characteristic of Trump's campaign and messaging, but it goes really quite far beyond rhetoric. We've got historic attacks taking place right now on a woman's right to choose on abortion, threats of mass deportations, and a growing climate in the US of repression and censorship. So Sequoia, I wanted to bring you in, if you could talk a little bit about the war on woke, that we are seeing the surge of the far right globally and the new age of McCarthyism. Like, what does Trump's victory mean for the struggle against the far right internationally?
Thanks a lot for that intro. Before touching on Trump and his that current of right wing, what you can describe as neo-fascism, I think in order to do justice to that question, we have to place it into the context of the USA. And perhaps we can first travel across the globe, over to South Korea, in fact. And there's a particular quote from 81-year-old Do Kyum-yen, who was arrested for protesting a US missile system placed in her village. And she proudly proclaimed, in response to being arrested, "I hate all US presidents." Now, I'm sure millions around the world nodded in agreement, and it's got some notoriety, that quote now. But for many people, whether Trump or Harris won, the oligarchy won. So although, and we'll come to that, there are differences, I think it's important to place this into context. And there were reports today, of course, of Trump's victory adding a record $64 billion to wealth of the richest top 10. Including Elon Musk, of course, as well as Bezos and Bill Gates. The choice at any US election, unfortunately, and this sort of builds on what Matthew was referring to, really, that the realistic and practical choice is US capitalism and human suffering with or without decorum. And there is obviously huge work to change that from a third party perspective, but there are significant structural barriers around lobbying and the media and such like. But just a quick reminder, some may be familiar with it, but there was a 2014 study that described the US as an oligarchy, in that voters effectively have no say in policy. And some regard that as a sort of epitaph where you can change the government, but not the policy. And to sort of build on that, many people argue that the US is effectively a fascist entity by definition. It was born of indigenous genocide and slavery, whether liberal or conservative, certain groups will be oppressed. And in this sense, both wings of the US establishment share the same historical and moral DNA. And what they represent is premised on white supremacist imperialism and authoritarianism. And to be honest, I think that's a strong argument, and it certainly has to be reckoned with. And the context is important. So both parties, part of the way that this is continued is that both parties are built on the same mythology and propaganda. And I think it's worth pondering on some cultural examples that lend weight to this. For example, the highest grossing film of all time, Avengers Endgame, one of the central characters in this is, of course, called Captain America. Now, I always think it's a useful thought experiment for anyone listening and watching to imagine if the highest grossing film of all time had a Captain China or a Captain Russia, Captain Iran, Captain Palestine, any of those things as its central character, it would be for many people galling, but certainly stark. And so I think it's important for us to understand the levels of propaganda and indoctrination. And the West, although it doesn't refer to it as such, the US has the largest prison labor camp system in the world, accounting for 25% of the world's prison population. And so I think these things are important for the overall context in the sense that they're features and not flaws of the US system. Now, to swing back around to Fiona's original point, there is more to it than that, in the sense that Trump does represent, support, and embolden a particular current of far-right forces, both domestically and globally. Some will be familiar with J.D. Vance, the vice president, who has certain, if we want to be diplomatic, conservative views on same-sex marriage, abortion, gun control. But these domestic policies have real-world impact on not just people in the US, but those beyond the borders. And it's worth pointing out that with regard to this as a global phenomenon and how the election of Trump helps to embolden these forces, in the UK, there is a very similar, I was going to say strain, currently embodied by Kemi Badenoch, an anti-woke yet Black woman of African descent who is infamous in some circles for downplaying racism and arguing that maternity pay is too excessive. Now, many people argued that these things should have already been case closed. These things should have been won, whether it's racism, maternity rights, abortion, etc. But history has a bad habit of returning. And this kind of, again, to describe it as neo-fascism without getting bogged down into the definitions, it's sort of come in the garb of culture wars, free speech, and this idea of taking back control that kind of exploits conditions of economic inequality and disenfranchisement. Now, whether you want to argue it's significantly different to what some people describe as liberal authoritarianism, such as in the case of pepper spraying students who are protesting against genocide, or similar, the bottom line is it's dangerous. And there are differentiating qualities when it comes to Trump and these far-right neo-fascistic forces. Again, as Fiona alluded to in the question, Trump has publicly supported armed white supremacists. One prominent example is Kyle Rittenhouse. And the scenes in Charlottesville that many people remember of fascists roaming the streets has a kind of normalizing impact where those ideas are legitimized in the highest office of state. Another thing, and this relates again back to Matthew's point about the electoral context, having a far-right president pushes the supposed political center further rightwards so that the whole discourse and choices become more right-wing. And just to say on Harris, it's an absolutely disastrous tactic, as has been shown, losing 13 million or thereabouts votes, trying to tack to the right, ignoring your base and trying to get elected on a ticket of patronizing your base and hoping for celebrity endorsements. I think the statistics bear that out. And also it normalizes some of the extreme right-wing policies. The fact that Harris was willing proudly and boldly to campaign on continuing building the wall to stop migrants from getting in is really an indictment of this point, and the fact that it's not just a disaster, although it is, of course, in terms of the direct human consequences, but the whole discourse and political spectrum is shifted to the right. Now, Biden and Obama, they both loved a good cage and deportation themselves. Obviously, in their case, it was done with a smile. But Trump has vowed to run the biggest deportation in US history. So if some of those vows, if some of those policies that they claim that they will pursue in office are enacted, it will, of course, be disastrous for minorities, whether they're Black, Native American, of East Asian descent, LGBT plus, and women, and so on. There is, I don't want to call it a silver lining, but there is something that can be taken from having someone like Trump in office, in that it forces the hand of so-called progressives to actually take some action. You'll remember in between 2016 and 20, there was a so-called resistance, but at least there was some coverage and rhetoric and discourse around progressive policies, certainly via the fact that there was a common enemy. Now, I think that can open up a space, again, come back to Matthew's point around building a third-party movement, but it has to be done in the right way, organizing principles, particularly in this context, which seems to be super polarized, and as we refer to, with those significant obstacles which are distinct to the US. And it's also worth remarking that a lot of the rhetoric around the so-called war on woke and culture wars are effectively a distraction. When you get working class people blaming other working class people for the sins of the ruling class, you know you're being played, or you should know you're being played. And of course, Trump or any leader could be spending the money on far better things. In a country where at least 26,000 people die every year from lack of healthcare and 500,000 people are homeless, there's clearly many things that the US and leaders could be spending the money on. So on the kind of challenges side of things, it's undoubtedly going to be much more difficult for minorities. We'll talk, of course, about foreign policy as well, but there are some opportunities in there. One other point just to finish on really is there's also the dangers posed by Trump's relationship with other right-wing forces around the world. For example, Milei in Argentina, in Israel, which we will definitely come to, and others such as Modi in India. And I hope there's some time to be able to talk about this in the session today around Latin America, Venezuela, and Bolivia, because Trump, not just rhetorically, but materially supports a lot of these fascistic movements, which have a direct threat to the stability of those countries. So there's no doubt to conclude that he is a threat to minorities domestically and will embolden some of those fascistic networks abroad, but there also can be within that some opportunity for real resistance, not liberal resistance.
Thank you, Sequoia. I think one of the things that you brought up, which is a really good point about having a common enemy, that can be a silver lining, although I do feel that in this case, the common enemy is China for the US. I mean, that's like the $1.6 billion bill that they passed for anti-China propaganda a few months ago. And, you know, so yeah, we're going to talk about Captain China right now. Obviously, the US sees China as a competitor that they want to stop. They want to stop the rise of China. And so, yeah, of course, propaganda-wise, we're hearing all these headlines about China collapsing at any moment. The economy is collapsing. Everything's collapsing. But if you can see, we're going to put up a World Economic Outlook little graph that predicts that China's growth in 2025 is going to be 4.5% versus the US's 2.2%. So obviously, China's still going to be rising, expanding a little bit more than the US. However, Trump has a solution for this. And his solution, of course, is anti-China tariffs. We're going to just like show a little clip of that, just so that we can see Trump's love of tariffs. So Martha's going to put up a little clip of
the Detroit situation, and we want to bring back company, and we're going to bring them back because you know why? The most beautiful word in the entire dictionary, you know what it is? It's tariff. The tariff. You're going to become so rich with the word tariff. You're going to become rich as hell. You're not going to know what to do with the money. I'm telling you.
Yeah, so you can see from this clip, Trump is doubling down on his strategy of tariffs. And this time around, Trump is promising a blanket tariff of 10% to 20% on nearly all imports and 60% or more on Chinese goods. However, a recent analysis by the Peterson Institute of International Economics found that if Trump did impose a 10% on all goods and a 60% on China, it would cost a typical household in the middle of the income distribution about $1,700 in increased expenses each year. So Anna, we're going to have you, if you can, speak on the impact of these policies on everyday Americans, and also, what do you think? How do you think China will deal with this escalating new Cold War?
Well, when you start talking about tariffs, I mean, we've been through this before. It's like first time as fast, second time as fast. All the media seems to be in incredible denial. I mean, I'm just appalled across the board. You know, poor Jill Stein and Cornel West, who I think I might actually have voted for, they didn't get a look in. And of course, the Americans were cheated of having the full range of opinions. You've got this weird, very strong polarization now, but it's within such a narrow channel. There is such narrow bandwidth there. So it was a staggering victory. And I think a lot of us were left wondering, well, how bad did Biden's performance over his 4-year term have to be for the American electorate to welcome Trump back from the politically dead? You know, like every screen monster, we thought he'd been killed off in the final reel of the original movie. Yet here he is back again with his tiny hands on the levers of power, and 4 more years of this. So I'm calling this the sequel Interesting Times 2, and this time it's personal. I think a lot of people are going to be extremely nervous that he's back in power. So for everyone wondering how the heck did this happen, you know, you could say, well, it's the economy, stupid, to use a very, very worn cliche. So there's no excuse in not knowing this, but it's all the other issues as well. I mean, of course, Roe v. Wade was important, but in 4 years, what moves did Biden and Kamala make to actually reverse that? It just seemed to be getting worse and worse. So Americans obviously aren't feeling the economy is doing any better under Biden, unlike what we've been told. You know, I've been watching a whole load of stuff on the American media, and they're saying, oh, but he's done this, he's done that, it's just so much better. You know, like Matt said, you know, 60% of people just aren't definitely not feeling it. You have all the footage of people, you know, the homeless people or on drugs, just this weird thing that's going on in the streets of America. In the wealthiest country in the world, this is happening. So on top of that, they're seeing billions of tax dollars being sent to the bottomless pit of war, the chief beneficiary being the military industrial complex war machine. They're seeing the suffering of the civilian population in Gaza and the prospect of another endless war, possibly engulfing the whole of the Middle East. They see a crackdown in democracy, from crushing protests to ending media independence. And, you know, they're really not getting anything better. So for many, the only growth areas have been poverty, drug addiction, homelessness, and despair. Unfortunately, voters seem to be associating better times with Trump's first few years in power before COVID. That was before he started firing torpedoes at our lifeboat and global growth engine. You know, America was living beyond its means after its great crash of 2008, and they still weren't out of the woods, even though China had come to the rescue, which everyone seems to be forgetting. You know, it's been forgotten that Trump pressured Jay Powell at the Federal Reserve, which is private, not state-owned, to keep bank rates down in order to inflate the markets. And markets, of course, are not the same as the economy. And that's how we got the Trump pump. You know, I remember that well until the Black Swan event of COVID that did what we were all expecting, crashed it so the rich could reload, you know, having sold their shares, stocks and shares the night before. So in this sugar rush delusion, everyone lost perspective. The nation racked up unimaginable debt, now standing at $36 trillion. And there is no legitimate way out of that. And the worry is, of course, you know, classically, there's one way to get yourself out of that sort of problem, and that is war. Yet again, it's like being one long war with America. So manufacturing still hasn't been brought home. How little would you have to pay an American worker to make a smartphone or an electric vehicle affordable for the average consumer if it's not being made cheaply abroad? So instead of building a concrete base to their reality, the US concocted an illusion spun out of candy floss and fairy dust, it seems. And the American dream is now a coma dream, and I wish they'd all snap out of it. When he started his hybrid war on China, he launched the trade war in 2017, 2018. Trump imposed these huge tariffs that the US consumer pays. And it seems that we all had to argue that for a long time before the penny dropped. And so he's doing that all over again, except even more. So that's how he kickstarted inflation and brought America's recovery from the Great Crash to a crashing end. Because do you remember for the beginning of the 21st century, you know, inflation was near zero. And it's like people need to join the dots and work out, well, if our stuff is being made really cheaply and lots of it in China, and we're able as a nation to live beyond our means, then what does that mean if he suddenly, you know, takes a wrecking ball to that? So people are surprised there's inflation. So, of course, someone has to be held to account for this sorry state of affairs. So who is it that they blame? Oh, China. So in picking on China, they get a 2-for-1, because China is both a scapegoat and the golden goose that's envied by an ailing Western system at the end of its cycle. So welcome to late capitalism. We're at the bit where it eats itself. And I said way back that China was the newly rich kid wearing a Rolex who'd strayed onto mafia turf and was about to get rolled. I knew as soon as Western leaders saw China's beautiful cities, growing wealth and social cohesion, that they'd want to knock it down like an angry toddler at the beach, you know, stomping on other kids' sandcastles. And here we are. There's no logic to it. It's just they're driven by so much envy, and never mind greenbacks. It's like the green-eyed monster is in charge of everything. So after years of acting as lowly factory to the world, China's finally caught up with the US and is overtaking it, both economically and technologically. And China is resented, not because it's doing anything wrong, because it's not, but because America's ruling elite rested on its laurels. The richest nation on the planet failed to invest in infrastructure and its people. It sucked the economy dry with vast profits and tax cuts until the top 1% holds about as much wealth as the bottom 90%. And today, even Elon Musk acknowledges that the country is going bankrupt. So the US and its mates have to get the Viking raiding party together. They aim to stop China's continued development and pillage the village. And to sally forth into this primitive act of destructiveness like dark age berserkers, they have to get the, you know, I'm sorry, I do see Trump and the rest like with these shields, you know, banging on their shields at these Nuremberg rally type things. But they have to get the taxpayers on board, as has been pointed out by various think tanks such as SimSec. I remember them saying that about 5 years ago. I'm thinking, oh my God, this is what they're going to be doing, you know, to brainwash the electorate, the American people. And that's exactly what they've been focusing on, because this is exactly what they're good at. And remember, it is America's Madison Avenue that established an army of psychologists and media in the advertising industry. And they're all expert at mass manipulation to persuade you to buy stuff you never knew you needed, or that new war that will look great hanging up in the closet next to the Armani. So we've seen this raft of laws targeting China, such as the American Competes Act of 2022. Instead of cooperating with China on stabilizing the world and combating climate change while we still have a chance, Biden failed to reverse Trump's aggression towards the country they decided to target as a rival. Biden doubled down and brought in his own China hate bounty, the state-funded character assassination project that started at $500 million and now it's budgeted at $1.6 billion, just to monster the rising superpower. So we have to remember that China was the stabilizing factor of the past two and a half decades. I could go on, but I feel I'm taking up a lot of time, so I can come back to this or carry on. It's up to you guys.
Well, I'm definitely loving what you're saying, Anna. So to do carry on. It'd be great if you finish up your points. Don't want to stop you.
Okay. Right, China was the stabilizing factor of the past 2.5 decades, and of course that this is just being covered up all the time. We're being gaslighted terribly about this. So while the US was on the rampage against the Patriot Act of 2001, resulting in the deaths of millions of Muslims, China was lifting 800 million of its own people out of poverty and creating this huge middle class with a stake in the world. It's a middle class almost twice the size of the population of the US. And we know it's never had a war or fired a shot in anger in 40 years. So how did they keep inflation so low at the beginning of the 21st century when there was stability? You know, it really felt like, at least, you know, apart from a few hotspots, the usual hotspots, Palestine, unfortunately, you know, being one, there did seem to be relative stability in the world after America seemed to be satisfied with their bloodletting, the Patriot Act bloodletting. So the reason they managed to keep inflation down was that China was the West's factory, making our affordable goods. So how did they do that? In part, it was huge economies of scale of production, which America doesn't have. China also had to cope, remember, with the manufacturing pollution that was transferred along there with the West's manufacturing, and necessity being the mother of invention. They are now the world's most advanced producer of renewables. I think it's ironic that every time they're hit with something like, chips, they're being denied chips, they suddenly leapfrog everyone and they just do even better. It's quite entertaining to watch that. So they did all these things to help stabilize America's broken economy. They bought US treasuries. They acted as a shock absorber. Bought US treasuries. They allowed global currencies to devalue against the yuan, taking the hit themselves. They encouraged consumption by their new middle class, and they embarked on an infrastructure campaign that also stimulated the global economy. And hawks conveniently forget that Wall Street made a mint off China. Not only the goods they produced there for domestic consumption at home, but also the in-country goods and services sold to the Chinese market, which made up around half of their profits. And he's going to wreck that. So as Trump threatens 60% tariffs on all goods from China and sanctions on China's trade partners, some are now saying de-Americanize has now become a guiding principle for American business as well as China. So in the face of economic and military threats by America, China's now selling its US treasuries. They're doing it slowly and responsibly. You know, some of us would say, you need to dump the whole lot at once, but they're not doing that. They're being very grown up about it. The US only has itself to blame for devaluing and weaponizing its own dollar, which is the world's currency reserve. They've absolutely screwed the pooch. It's just unbelievable to watch. All this time, Biden was supposed to have been working together with China to battle climate change. He had 4 years to get that going. Instead, he started wars across the world. And apart from all the killing and the destruction, war is one of the biggest polluters on the planet. The US military, being bigger than the next 9 or 10 countries put together, is the worst polluter of all. It accounts for over 40% of the world's military spending. And yet it points an accusing finger at China. And when you point the finger, all together, we know what this means. 3 fingers are pointing back at you. So I'll finish on this Thucydides trap. You know, is it inevitable that we're going to go to war? The late capitalism move to war was always likely, but not inevitable. If your analysis shows that this destructive trajectory is the only possible outcome if events are left to unfold by themselves, then we are screwed. But if you have faith in human ingenuity to change the course of history for the better, then that's what we should be doing. Unfortunately, the two candidates, Trump and Harris, are like machines on a set course, incapable of acting beyond the mechanistic imperatives of might is right. It's an ugly combination of jungle law with machine logic. It shows the limits of their thinking in a very narrow bandwidth. The whole thing is a right shower. Thankfully, China and the global south can see what's coming down at them down the pike. They know that the light at the end of the tunnel is a train coming straight at them, so they're taking evasive and preventative action. BRICS is a trade alliance that could yet save the world again.
Thanks so much for that, Anna, and the message of hope at the end, which is so important, because I think we are in a struggle against the drive to a third world war. But we can't treat this as an inevitability, and we need to build a global movement against that. Obviously, if it came down to the balance of forces in the West right now, in the global North, in the US, as this election result shows, we would be probably on a losing streak. But when you look internationally, we're part of a global majority, and I think that's like a really important point to emphasize. And just want to deal now with Trump's foreign policy, because I think this is very, very misunderstood and there's a lot of distortion in the media. So starting off with a clip from Trump's victory speech.
Powerful military, and ideally we don't have to use it. We had no wars, 4 years, we had no wars, except we defeated ISIS. We defeated ISIS in record time. But we had no wars. They said, he will start a war. I'm not going to start a war. I'm going to stop wars.
Okay, let everyone just take a moment there. That's very much a gaslighting clip for us all. But basically, this is obviously incredibly deceptive rhetoric from Trump. I mean, let's just talk about quickly his last term in office, where Trump continued the war in Afghanistan, expanded the war on Yemen, killed Iranian General Soleimani. He launched coups against democratically elected governments in Latin America, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. In 2017, he provocatively recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which was a hugely controversial move against the Palestinians. He did arm Ukraine and Taiwan and withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and of course launched this new Cold War against China, which Anna's just been speaking about. So quite the opposite of a record of someone who is anti-war or isolationist. So just to sort of get through some of that. But unfortunately, this type of rhetoric often does cause people to claim absurdly that Trump is an isolationist and that he is even an anti-war president. And that's especially in regards to how he has spoken about Ukraine. And obviously there's a lot of media coverage right now speculating about whether or not he's going to freeze that conflict. So we'll see what happens with that. But we've got this clip here from Vance, which suggests a different reality. So I'm just going to share that here.
Sources to you. Because Kamala Harris has been sending so many resources to Ukraine, we actually don't have enough to send to Taiwan. So by defending, by approaching the Russia-Ukraine situation in the way that we have, we've actually made it more likely that the Chinese will invade Taiwan, and we need to pursue a foreign policy that makes it less likely. And that's what's going to change when Donald Trump's president.
Okay, so a really big question, Matt. Could you debunk this idea that Trump is an isolationist? And could you explain, in your view, what is the Republican Party's approach to foreign policy going to be? What should we expect in the next 4 years?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. I think you did a pretty good job of running down Trump's, I shouldn't say a pretty good job. You did a great job running down Trump's previous administration, right? And as we all know, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And I mean, this is what we're looking at. We've already seen just in these 2 days a remarkable amount of conversation about who is going into Trump's government. And, just another adage, right? Personnel is policy. And so as we see who is going to be staffing the NSC, the CIA, the Department of Defense, the Department of State. It's a lot of the same names that were with Trump 4 years ago. The important thing to realize about these men and women are that they're true believers, that these are real believers in a Manichaean struggle, a struggle of good versus evil, us versus them. And that any of us, I mean, even I just listened to, just Sequoia and Anna, your comments were so brilliant. And if you all have those written down, if you could send those to me, I'd love to read them after again, because I thought you guys they were so great. But, we could have Sequoia and Anna go in there and lay all this out for the people who are going in the Trump administration. And it doesn't matter, because this is about identity to them. This is about ideology to them. This is about an imperial outlook that makes up who they are. Whereas that makes it differ, that differs from the Democratic side of the imperial ledger, if you will. But because the Republicans are much more certain in their determination that what they are doing is part of the great timeline of history, right? So if you want to, what we see now in a Mike Pompeo, a Robert O'Brien, these types that will fill out the Trump administration's international and foreign policy and military and intelligence services. These are men and women who what they say comes from manifest destiny. What they say is a continuation of the doctrine of discovery. What they believe they are doing is righteous. And so when we try and analyze them and predict or contemplate what they will do, you have to take it from that lens. Now, like any other aspects of Washington, D.C., any other aspects of the empire, there are other factors at play here. And certainly they have their allegiances, they have their bios, they have biases, they have their constituencies that's going to inform how they act. That clip from J.D. Vance is absolutely perfect. That really delineates, that really defines the Republican Party these last several years. Roughly the one half of, say, the House of Representatives that are Republican who are against the Ukraine war. It's about spending the money on the Ukraine war, because those men and women in the House, they view spending $185 billion killing Russians as not worth it. Spending $185 billion preparing Taiwanese to kill Chinese, totally worth it, right? So there is a mindset that does have some parochial interests, does have some biases, does have some institutional and constituency preferences that, you can compare to the Democrats. But what will occur, particularly with like Ukraine and Russia, we saw today, maybe it was yesterday, leaks coming out of, not even leaks, there were conversations that reporters had with members of Trump's team describing what Trump's plan for Ukraine is. It's key to note that that plan includes plenty of arms sales, right? So there's not an idea of demilitarizing Eastern Europe. There's not this idea of pursuing a peace for the sake of stability and security. It's essentially to get the best out of both ways. So that the idea being, if you can freeze the conflict but still keep the arms sales going, well, then that gives something to everybody, right? And that's what you see with Trump a lot of times, this type of deal making, his desire to be as transactional as possible in anything he does. But with Ukraine, Trump could run into an issue. The Democrats will further double down on their use of Ukraine, the broader issues of Russia, Putin equals Trump. We are Democrats versus autocrats. That decade-long campaigning that's been so important to the Democratic Party's identity, both as an institution and on the individual levels. We still have plenty of Democrats in the United States who are flying blue and yellow flags outside of their home. This is the reason why, go back a year, go back to September of 2023, and the Biden-Harris first campaign ad is Joe Biden going to Kyiv, this idea of a wartime president, again, standing up for the tyrant Vladimir Putin, defending democracy from autocracy, right? Of course, a very nice mirror to their domestic political campaigns. But, getting back to this idea of what we can expect to see, again, we've seen it already. We understand who is coming into office. And so we're going to have an imperial agenda through a Trump White House that differs in its colors and its degrees from the Biden imperial agenda. But, overall, it's more of the same. Certainly, we can go point by point if you want to different places, but, I think I'll leave it there at the moment.
Thank you for that, Matt. And,
Well, we definitely love to hear.
Go ahead, Fiona.
No, I was just going to say we definitely would like to hear point for point, but maybe we could save that to the final thoughts part or something, because I think that would be really interesting. Sorry. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. We don't want you to censor yourself. In terms of, you mentioned you're the second person here who's requested a transcript to these speeches. So I feel the pressure of saying that we will release transcripts of speeches on our Patreon. So there you go. The people speak. But onto another really important electoral issue this cycle, which is the US-Israel genocide in Gaza and the escalating war in West Asia. Certainly, the Biden administration was instrumental in funding, perpetuating, and escalating in this region. But obviously, Trump also has a record of being extremely pro-Israel, to the point where Israel far-right PM Netanyahu openly backed his election. And also, if you remember, too, during the Biden-Trump US presidential debates, Trump said Israel needed to finish the job in Gaza and actually called Biden, who was overseeing the genocide, a Palestinian. Sequoia, can you speak to what Trump's return means for this region?
Certainly, and thanks for that introduction. A bit like the previous answer, I think it's worth us traveling to the global south to get an opinion. But before doing so, I think you'll all be familiar, certainly in the US and UK, with this absurd condemnation game that took place since October 2023. So I just think it's a perfect opportunity to make my own views very clear, that I unequivocally and without any qualification condemn the settler colonial genocidal entity named Israel and hope for a fully liberated Palestine. Now, to get the view of one particular Palestinian who was asked whether there would be a difference in the election of Trump or Harris, is a retired university teacher called Ayad Barghouti, and they said, what Biden was doing before with a low profile, Trump will be more vocal about. Biden would say in public, we're not trying to starve Gaza, we're trying to give them food aid, all the while supporting Israel's army. Trump will say it in a clear way that we're trying to get rid of such and such people. He will not play the game of trying to make himself sound like a humanitarian. Similarly, another Palestinian was asked the same question. What we have seen has made us believe the whole of Western ideology is a lie. And this is the sort of contradiction, if you like, of so-called Western values. They'll destroy your land, kill your people, and tell you it's because they care. But at least when it comes to Trump, the veil is off, and the liberal mind cannot claim to be fooled. But as Matthew sort of alluded to, or rather very clearly stated, will anything actually change? Now, we don't have time right now to do a sort of thorough overview of all the barbarity that's taken place. Such is the scale of a year of genocide. But suffice to say, starvation, massacre, bombing every school, university, hospital, and very conservative estimates of 42,000 people killed, but could be up to, the Lancet, for example, quoted as being around 180, maybe even 300,000 people killed. And it's worth just pointing out, while we're discussing this, the horrendous and absurd propaganda in the West, the UK, and the US in particular, that describes Israel's clear, both in terms of intent and actions, genocidal horrors that they inflict on Palestine as self-defense. And I think it is important to note, in terms of international law, that that's not even accurate. As an occupying force, they don't have a right to self-defense against those for whom they occupy. And just to note, I think it's important to state clearly as well that it's not just the right-wing media, so Fox News or the Sun, etc. in the UK and the US. It's the New York Times, Washington Post, BBC, Guardian, the so-called liberal progressive wing of the corporate media, who have published absurd claims. Again, if we have time, we can go into a bit more detail about the role that propaganda has played both for Democrats and Trump's actions. And just one last point on that. There's a particular phrase that has done the rounds, which is every accusation is a confession, in that Israel will take some of the most extreme and heinous acts that they've committed, some of which were decades ago, for example, putting a baby in an oven, pulling a woman's uterus out, etc., and claiming Palestinians have done that. And it's important for us to understand the role of that atrocity propaganda, whether it was a Biden regime or Trump. And just to say, I think everyone here and anyone listening will be familiar with seeing the videos over the last year that are frankly some of the most horrific, the worst things that any of us have seen in any context. One of the most prominent examples was Hind Rajab, but there's others such as Sidra Reem, the young girl who was whose grandfather famously described as the soul of my soul. Again, we can go into more of these, but what I think is astounding and will likely continue is the level of impunity afforded to the Israeli regime. And we have this odd and frankly sickening phenomenon with this generation of TikTok soldiers who are committing genocide, where they not only commit a crime, they not only admit it, not only celebrate it, not only film it, not only film themselves celebrating it, but they also then post it. And we have this situation of these multiple levels of evil being publicly celebrated, and that was under a Democrat. And so we've got Trump stating that he's happy to support and is a great friend of Netanyahu. So it is massively worrying. But as has been said, Biden has not just been complicit, he's been a central player in arming, along with Western allies, or I think possibly more accurate to describe them as Western proxies in Europe. But a quick appraisal of what the Biden regime has done to assist the genocide, and I would open it to others as well and say, do you think any of these things would be any different under Trump? It's questionable at best. They blocked UN resolutions, and as we know, the UN is supposed to be the international body that provides a mandate for action according to the UN Charter and Genocide Convention. And again, I think this is a very important point. It's a slight aside, but a worthwhile one. In the sort of history of recent Western interventions, there's this ridiculous discourse around the notion of humanitarian intervention and responsibility to protect, which has its so-called intellectual heavyweights in figures like Samantha Power, Bernard Henri Levy, etc. And you would expect those people in this instant as almost the ultimate textbook case of humanitarian intervention to be shouting from the rooftops, but it's notable you don't hear it anywhere. The Biden regime has also put pressure on the ICC, which has still not issued arrests warrants, and has also tried to put pressure on South Africa in relation to its case with the International Court of Justice. And for anyone listening, I would strongly recommend reading their summary of the recent report they submitted to the ICJ, and similarly the very detailed report written by this UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese. And yet, when it comes to Biden, they want us to believe that they embody human rights. Now, the Democrats, including some of you might be familiar with this person, Matthew Miller, who has this almost vampiric look about him, they, I think, are very lucky that the worst so far that they've had to endure is humiliation of an electoral defeat, because their punishment, frankly, should be far worse. But there is at least one small consolation in that their legacy, and certainly their names will be remembered this way, will be one of genocide, of course, genocide, Joe, and Holocaust Harris. But again, will any of this change under Trump? I think it was really interesting, Matthew, that you used a formulation of this similar phrase that I always try to understand or predict people in political realm actions by their deeds shall ye know them. In that you will get 1,000,001 different things said, but if you've got a past record of the deeds, this is the strongest predictor or indicator of their actions. And this is somewhat of a reiteration, but I think it's worth saying again, looking at his record, Trump bombed 8 countries. And this point is often forgotten, even on the left. It was the strongest conventional bomb used in human history. But Trump dropped the so-called Moab on Afghanistan. And again, I always come back to these thought experiments. Can you imagine if Russia had dropped the Moab on Belgium or something? Everyone would know about it. And it's one of those things that you sort of, it's a major event and crime, but is almost written out of history. Again, as you said, in terms of Palestine, recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, tore up numerous long-standing international missile treaties, and scrapped CPO with Iran. But again, I'm going to reiterate slightly Matthew's point, but this is a very slightly different formulation. So personnel is policy. I just saw it the other day and I quite liked it, that the personnel is political. This is another little sort of reformulation of the same point, but also, again, a bit of a reiteration here, but I think there are some slight differences in emphasis between the different wings in terms of who they are more likely and willing to target. There was that old adage in some neoconservative foreign policy circles around real men go to Iran. And I think some of that wing really see Iran as the test, if you like. So I think the Democrats, it's Russia, and they're harsher when it comes to DPRK, North Korea, whereas the Trump regime is much likely to be harsher with China and Iran. It's worth just quickly mentioning, of course, the ridiculous astronomical amounts that the US spends on so-called defense, between 800 billion and $1 trillion budget for murder and destruction. And these weapons, of course, need to be tested on something, or rather, as we know, someone. And I don't think there's going to be any structural changes there, despite some of the rhetoric from Trump around no wars and we will get immediate peace in Ukraine and, as he describes it, the Middle East. Another factor when it comes to Palestine and influence, again, I think this was touched upon, but I think there's definitely space to talk more about the influence and impact of the lobbying system, that basically a form of legalized constitutional corruption in the US, and AIPAC is a significant component of that. 365 out of 435 representatives are funded by Israel, of foreign countries. And what's perhaps striking about it is the fact that they willingly brag about it, so that they'll happily post these details. And then the same breath, people talk about Russian interference. And you'll say, where? What do you mean? Oh, a few Facebook posts, right? And then you've got this whole massive campaign of lobbying that has significant influence. I will say another quick point, because I think it's important, because a lot of people listening will likely come from sort of progressive backgrounds. It's important to clarify the dynamic when it comes to AIPAC and lobbying. Israel does not control the US. It's the other way around. Israel is essentially a strategic forward base for US and Western geostrategic interests, and it bombs common enemies with the West, so Syria, Lebanon, Iran. That's not coincidence. It's not to say AIPAC doesn't have influence, it certainly does, but they're more successful as a lobby group because they align with US strategy in West Asia. And these dynamics are present as the Palestinians who were asked this question very much, they know very clearly and experience it very clearly. It's also worth mentioning in this context the role of the arms trade, if you like, and the fact that some people say, oh, they're giving lots of arms, they're giving lots of money to Israel, but in effect, they're subsidizing their own arms industries with public money. So they're making a lot of money, although, yes, on paper, they're giving 3.8 billion or thereabouts a year in subsidies to Israel, but a lot of it gets washed back in to that corporate economy. One important way in which Trump might make things worse, though, for Palestine relates to Israel's intended destruction of the UN relief agency UNRWA. It provides basic services to around 870,000 Palestinians in the West Bank, and the vast majority in Gaza. And Trump previously, again coming back to that by the deeds shall you know them point, suspended funding to UNRWA in 2018. Now, it all sounds very depressing, and because the situation is dire when it comes to Palestine, certainly. But being someone who's based in the UK, and we've got colleagues in the US, there are actions that people can take. And yes, I think protest is one of those key things that's very important. But I think this last year has shown the limitations of A to B marches. So I would suggest that people both in the US, and it's becoming increasingly more successful, look into direct action and civil disobedience groups like Palestine Action. Again, we can talk more about this if there's time. Another point, just to sort of counter the doom and gloom point, is even in Western countries, the vast majority of the people in most of those countries support a ceasefire. I know the bar's low there, but at least they're not all genocidal maniacs. A quick word, because I'm conscious of time, but the configuration when it comes to the rest of West Asia, be it in Lebanon, Iran, Yemen, Syria, etc., I think some of the key dynamics will remain under Trump. I think they will still be providing arms to Israel to bomb Lebanon. Hopefully, the resistance will be able to retain its deterrence. At the moment, Israel's not been able to make inroads in the south of Lebanon, and every time they're successfully resisted, they respond by killing civilians, which seems to be one of their formulations. And just a word on Iran, because I do think there is potential danger of a evolution of Trump's kind of maximum pressure policy. He, of course, pulled out of the JCPO deal in 2015, killed Soleimani, as has been mentioned. So there are potential grounds for escalation, again, because of the personnel as well. So I think we have a responsibility in the West to try to counter that where it's possible. Similarly, with Yemen, I think that Ansar Allah, or Houthis as they're often referred to, have done amazing work in solidarity with Palestine, but they're likely to be victims of Trump's bombs. And again, this is always worth mentioning because people, even on the left, tend not to be aware or tend not to talk about this, but the US still occupies a significant proportion of Syria, around 1/3 of the country, the oil-rich part. So if there is even the tiniest bit of hope that any of what Trump says is remotely true, perhaps we can be hopeful of some sort of withdrawal there. But in terms of the resistance axis, I think they are going to be the same force. The fundamental same forces are going to be at play. But just to come back quickly to Anna's point, in terms of the broader historical trajectory of geopolitics, if you like, there is some hope with the development of BRICS, this multipolar moment, and we're seeing the global South converge and grow those links. And in many cases, they've become a lot more comprehensive and strategic, which will help, something we haven't really touched upon today, but will help counter the effects of things like sanctions as well, which the US sanctions a whole third of the world. So just conscious, because there's so much to say about West Asia, but ultimately significantly echoing what's said earlier, but I think it was really important for us to be able to give a bit of a zoomed out overview of the situation in Palestine. It is very difficult, and we see the horrors daily, but we have a responsibility in our own countries to take what action we can, and hope that the resistance axis can deliver appropriately against the genocidal regime. So,
thank you for that, Sequoia. I think shifting back to the focus on China, I wanted to sort of pull on one of the threads that you said, Sequoia, which is like the playbook of the US is to use defense protection as a pretext for going in and invading a country or spreading democracy. I'm going to ask you, Anna, to expand on Matt's previous point about how a faction of Republicans believe shifting resources to containing China is the way forward. And we're going to play another clip from our favorite person, JD Vance, that gives us an insight into the framing for furthering Biden's war drive against China, using Taiwan as a pretext for escalation.
Make it as costly as possible for the Chinese to invade Taiwan in the first place. Everyone will tell you that if the Chinese establish territory in Taiwan, if they establish a beachhead in Taiwan, it becomes very hard and a lot of people get killed. So you prevent them from doing that. And the way you prevent them from doing that is to make sure they've got enough weapons to defend themselves. Again, prevention is the best way to stop a war. An ounce of deterrence is worth a lot more than a pound of stupid foreign policy from communists. An ounce of deterrence is worth a lot more than a pound of stupid foreign policy from communists. An ounce of deterrence.
Oh no, just like, I think he heard that I'm such a big fan of his that he had to echo and repeat himself several times. So basically the beginning of that clip is a little bit cut off, but essentially JD said something like, in order to prevent, the solution to preventing a war with China is to weaponize Taiwan. Obviously, an essential part of US foreign policy is the militarization of the Asia Pacific. And that has been massively ratcheted up by the Biden administration with AUKUS, the rearming of Japan, and pushing for an Asian NATO. So, Anna, are we heading for a hot war over Taiwan? And also, what are the real dynamics here? Can you debunk the US propaganda in JD's clip?
Well, they've done this from the start. It's like black is white, white is black. It's. I think they're just doing it deliberately now. It's. I bet you that they're taking bets. So somebody's is like, how outrageous do you think we can be? And people are gonna believe it. It shows not a great deal of respect for their audiences. To me, listening to Sequoia, I just keep thinking, oh, Rosa Luxemburg was right then. It's barbarism or socialism, really, isn't it? Another maybe a glimmer of hope is that, we know that Trump is making all these alliances with absolute monsters, a rogues gallery of just horrors across the globe. But when you look at, say, in Argentina, Milei's just crashed his economy, hasn't he? Schultz looks as if he's in trouble politically. So these geniuses, there's only just so much of this momentum that they can take advantage of before the wheels start falling off. And it's like, yeah, hurry up and fall off, wheels. I think the whole thing is an assault on 400 years of the Age of Enlightenment. So when we hear people like Vance just saying something where the opposite is obviously true, you know, and they've been saying this for several years now. They've gone from the one China policy to now, oh, it was always this way. It was ever thus. You know, Taiwan was never part of China, you know, in which case, if that's true, then why have they got this museum with all the greatest of China's treasures that Chiang Kai-shek and his lot took over to the Republic of China, you know, after World War II, that they've got this jade cabbage, carved cabbage. Do you know that one that apparently is worth about $100 billion that's in this museum, and it's all Chinese treasures. So it's an absolute joke. You know, China, the last thing China wants is a war with Taiwan. You've got families, Chinese families, that are split across the strait. You know, it is Chinese. America has been arming Taiwan. You know, Taiwan is probably the most important link in this chain. And when you look at the map, you see, oh, wow, they really, really are hemmed in by this chain all the way from, you know, Japan coming down to the Ryukyu Islands and, you know, Taiwan. And you can see that their enemies want to keep them there. And they're even attacking their back door out through Xinjiang, you know, the Belt and Road that was going through the old Silk Road, out through the entire length of the Europe-Asia landmass. I remember being very excited in 2017 when the first China freight train arrived here in Barking. I thought, wow, this is great. I can go and relax and do other things. I don't have to be worried about geopolitics anymore. That was such a great moment. But I've got up on my screen Wikipedia, the Wikipedia page, list of US arms sales to Taiwan. And the whole thing is a joke. You know, even under cuddly Jimmy Carter, that there were loads of armaments sent there. So the whole island is bristling with American missiles. You've got military there. You've got that Kinmen Island that's literally, what, about 5 miles from Xiamen city. It's really close. It's almost as if you had Canvey Island, you know, a load of foreign soldiers. I don't know whoever your enemy might be. Could be American, could be Russian, who knows. So if you had enemies on there, you'd be really, really worried. And the idea that China's not allowed to defend itself, and that we're hearing how they're tooling up, they're getting all these weapons, they're building up their military. It's like, well, wouldn't you, if you had some great big bully pointing a gun at your face, you know, of course you'd be absolutely stupid not to do that. So I really recommend that everyone goes to the Wikipedia page and just have a look at the arms. That it's like, you know, every few months there's a load of death machines being sent there. You know, and this, I've got a real thing about that pivot to Asia in 2010. That was so important. That was Obama, again, the cuddly Democrats doing this, because I think the Republicans have sort of got into the swing of, oh, it's quite nice, we're making a lot of money from them, you know, just let it go on. Wall Street absolutely loved the trade. But then Obama and Hillary decided to build on the great game. There's always been this great game, hasn't there? You know, I remember seeing Carry On Up the Khyber Pass when I was a kid, and that's probably my first exposure to what was going on there. And then, of course, you grow up, or not, and realize that there's this long, deep politics to do with it. So, you know, what had been bubbling away in the background was finally activated by Obama in 2010. And this was after, this is a whole subject that I'm writing about in my Shakedown timeline, that he was humiliated. Obama was this young politician. He knew nothing about China. He just wasn't interested in China. And then he got humiliated because Britain, who I think of as Iago dripping poison in Othello's ear, got him to sort of stand in for the wealthy West during COP15 in 2009 in Copenhagen. And he was really humiliated because they got found out. There was this Danish treaty that was the stitch up of the poorer nations. And I think Obama never really came back from that. So the next year, you know, we have this pivot. Hillary's manifesto, that thing that she wrote in, not the Atlantic, what was it that she wrote it in? Was it Foreign Policy? Where basically it's the same thing all over again. Oh, here's the Europe Asia landmass. We want that. And like, as if you're playing a game of Risk, you want to take that central part, or a game of chess, you know, you want the central part, which is like Afghanistan, all those countries around there. So, you know, there was that building as well. The whole thing is just appalling. I think these people, are they bored? I just don't understand. They want excitement. They want war. They want to play with the toys. As soon as they get in, the first thing they do is open the toy box. You know, and they want to use it. Trump is on record as saying, well, if we got these things, you know, why can't we use them? Which is probably the most terrifying things that I've, you know, that I heard him, one of the most terrifying things that I've ever heard him say. So the arms sales to Taiwan since 1979 never stopped. You know, it's hundreds of millions of dollars worth of military gear every year. And imagine what would happen if China did that with Hawaii or the Bahamas. You know, look what happened to Cuba when Russia, you know, after the Bay of Pigs invasion attempt, Russia tries to reinforce Cuba with armaments. That almost goes nuclear. And I thought we'd learned from that. But obviously, you know, we haven't. So there's this noose of American bases around China. Taiwan is just key. America couldn't care less what happened to Taiwanese. Obviously, they couldn't care less what happens to Uyghurs. You know, they've killed enough Muslims over time. I think Guantanamo is still open, isn't it? So that's what we're dealing with. People who are attacking 400 years of the Age of Enlightenment, attacking science, attacking the meaning of words. You know, they are great manipulators, and the whole thing is a bit of a head fuck.
Well, on that topic of well, I won't repeat the swearing, but I mean, we've dealt really with one of the huge existential threats facing humanity, which is this US war drive. So just to end the show on dealing with the other one, which is obviously climate catastrophe. Trump is pretty infamously against taking action on climate change. During his last term of president, he started the process of withdrawing the US from the UN Paris Agreement. And obviously one of his key slogans this time around has been drill, baby, drill. And he's got a really key pledge around increasing fossil fuel production in the United States. So I'm just going to share a little clip right now, because it's really important to acknowledge that actually the United States, in terms of production of oil and gas, has actually been on the rise under both Trump and Biden administrations in the last 3 successive US administrations. And I mean, this is in the context, you know, the US is doubling down on fossil fuels at a time when we need massive investment in renewables, which China is, of course, leading the way on. And this is in the context of the latest warnings of the United Nations just last month in October that humanity is currently now on course for a catastrophic 3 degrees of warming. So I mean, we don't need to like project into the future to see what's actually happening, though. 2023 was the hottest year in human history, with nearly half of the days breaching that 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature limit, which has been set by the UN. And scientists, of course, fearing that 2024 could be even hotter. I think new data is actually coming out on that as we speak. And then we can turn to the devastating real-world impacts of climate change that we are already witnessing. So just to give a few, in October this year, the Sahara Desert flooded for the first time in nearly half a century. In 2023, there were floods in Libya, which killed over 5,000 people, with more than 10,000 reported missing due to Storm Daniel, which made landfall, bringing severe weather conditions. This year in Brazil, there's been catastrophic flooding, resulting in 181 fatalities, and considered to be the country's worst flooding in 80 years. And of course, the coverage actually in the mainstream mass media tends to focus more on things that happen in the global north in terms of climate disaster. So we've seen a lot of coverage of what's happened in Spain recently in terms of the flooding, which killed over 214 people. So, we are witnessing all of these things happening right now, and we're on track for something a lot more catastrophic in the near future. So, Matt, I was wondering if you could come in. Obviously, you're a member of the Green Party in the United States. What can we expect from a Trump presidency on climate change? What is the relationship between empire, militarism, and climate? And also, just where is the US population at on this issue?
Well, thanks, Fiona. The US population, it continues to show up in polls that 20%, 30% are concerned. Other polls will show more than that. Younger generations are obviously more concerned about climate change and the climate collapse, and older generations. But there's not much action on it. And what we see essentially, you have the chart there, both parties, White Houses, whether they're Democrat or Republican, continue to do the bidding of the fossil fuel industry. I'll say the one chart you had with the crude oil production, if you add in the oil and the gas production as well, and those bars remain the same, the United States has actually been the largest producer of oil and gas in the world for the last 5 years, record amounts. So every year is historically the United States produces more oil and gas than anyone else in the world. That is basically has to do with fracking, which of course was, if you look back at the Obama administration, one of his proudest accomplishments. Barack Obama infamously, after his time in office, would brag about how much oil he produced, how no one had ever pumped as much oil and gas as he had, alongside of also bragging about how the banks owed him because he was so good to him, right? And then Trump comes in, picks up from where Obama left off, and the same with the Biden White House. When you look at the priorities, and this is where you really have to see how the empire works and how this climate collapse, this climate crisis is the result of empire. If you look at the priorities within the United States, it was brought up before about how much the United States spends on its military. The base Pentagon budget this year will be about $900 billion. When you add in care for veterans, the nuclear weapons that are within the Department of Energy, the State Department's foreign military sales programs, as well as the interest on past military and war spending, that number really is about $1.4 trillion a year that the United States spends on war and its military. The United States, through the Inflation Reduction Act, which was cited as being historic, as being a real commitment to taking on climate change, we spend approximately about $38 to $40 billion a year on climate change actions through our federal government, through the Inflation Reduction Act. So 1.4 trillion versus $40 billion. Just to put that in even further context, this year, the United States Congress appropriated $38 billion worth of weapons that the Pentagon didn't even ask for, right? So that the Congress is spending as much money on ships, planes, tanks, what have you, that the Pentagon didn't even ask for, as they are on combating climate change. We know, as brought up earlier as well, the United States military is the world's largest polluter. That's across all aspects of what we're talking about, all aspects of environmental harm, whether it's actual just straight pollution, poisoning the ground, poisoning the air, poisoning the water, through climate change. The United States military is the world's largest institutional emitter of carbon. Very frankly, they are ExxonMobil's biggest customer. And so that you can understand those linkages in between, when you look at the American empire and you understand the elites that populate the empire, the various power centers that populate the empire, and you have these various industries, if you want to call them that, certainly where you have that linkage then between the banks, the fossil fuel companies, and the weapons companies that then help determine American foreign policy, you can see that quite clearly, how they're all in this together. What's good for you is good for me. Best example I can give you of how this works in practice is with regards to, say, the Ukraine war. You have this case where in the 2012 debates, Barack Obama had a viral moment because he criticized Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney was asked in the debates, who is the greatest adversary for the United States? And Mitt Romney said Russia. And Barack Obama said something along the lines of like, hey, Mitt, the Cold War's calling. They want their foreign policy back. But then within 6 months to a year, the United States had taken an incredibly adversarial turn in its relationship with Russia. And there's a number of reasons for that. But one of the prime reasons is because you've had this fracking boom and you're now producing all this gas. And where are you going to sell it? And at that point, the biggest market for that gas was Europe. And who's the biggest supplier of gas to Europe? It's Russia, right? I mean, so you can understand the genesis of the Ukraine conflict. Again, other reasons for it as well. But one acute reason is this desire to capture the energy market in Europe for American producers. And so when people say there are no winners in this Ukraine-Russia war, it's actually, no, there is. The American energy companies are the winners, because what happened was you had the war, the invasion of Ukraine. You have the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, which in itself was a ecological catastrophe, right? Caused incredible environmental harm. It's incredible release of methane and other things as well. So it's the destruction of the sea life in that area. Just a historic amount, biblical amount almost. But what you have, though, is you have the winner, one of the winners of this war has been the American energy companies, because they have won, if you want to call it that, the European gas market for the U.S. So you see how these things tie themselves together, and you can see these relationships and how the decisions are made, because it benefits various actors within the American empire that populate the elites of the American empire. What this means as we go forward in the future, and I think people understand the idea of the climate collapse is going to lead to issues with resources. You're going to have issues with food security, droughts, population migration, those sorts of things. Those are all things that will make the world less secure. They're all things that will make the world less stable. And of course, people can very clearly see how, nations could go to war over those resources. It's possible, likely, maybe, but the main driver of conflict that will come from the climate collapse, that the climate collapse itself, of course, being pushed by the militarism of the American empire, and then those outside the empire that are responding to the empire's militarism, right? That collapse is going to push pressures on societies that are going to result in leaders that come to power on top of societies that are suffering. And when you have suffering societies that are suffering, you often have more extreme governments, right? And then with those more extreme governments, you tend to have degrees of nationalist desires, right? Or just even the need to distract by going to war. I think Anna brought that up earlier, right? And that's that's as old as recorded history. Certainly pull out your volume of Gibbons, and you'll see all types of where the Roman Empire was doing that, right? But so what the climate collapse does is makes it more likely that wars will occur, one, because of resource issues, but also two, because of the harm, the pressure, the stress that societies will be under. You're more likely to have governments come to power that are looking for war as an answer to the problems of society, problems, again, that come from the climate collapse. So it's very much, the relationship is very much there. It's a self-reinforcing relationship. So as the militarism gets worse, the climate collapse gets worse. As the climate collapse gets worse, the militarism gets worse, right? It becomes the point now where it's almost a chicken and egg type of problem if you try and pull it apart and determine which is the actual prime driver of this. I'll also say one last thing. When this, we have in a couple of weeks, the next COP, the next climate conference, annual climate conference meetings occurring in Azerbaijan, if I remember correctly. And, you know, what you will see there, like you have seen in all these various treaties, all these various conferences, all these various commitments, is that the militaries are always excluded. So if you look at the Paris Accords, you look at you know, anything that comes out of the COPs, anything that has to do in most governments, particularly the NATO governments, the militaries are excluded from any thing having to do with climate controls. With any attempt to mitigate what is occurring, the militaries are exempt from that. And so that's an issue as well, because these militaries, we have the militarism that exists throughout the world makes these militaries off limits to even the thing that is the gravest and most existential threat we are facing, of course, aside from nuclear war.
Brilliant. I mean, very important to bring those two existential crises together, actually, because they are just so linked. And, you know, all of this militarism is just stopping the release of trillions of dollars that we need to get that green transition to have a chance of saving humanity. So it's really important to kind of make those links like you did there. Well, we're basically coming to the end of our first ever Empire Watch Live. Before we close things down, we do want to have a chance in the last few minutes for final thoughts from our guests, because there's been so much covered in this discussion, and just want to make sure everyone's got a chance to sort of come back on anything that you've heard, or have a chance to sort of raise anything you think, oh, hang on, this is the key point that we're missing here. But I just think it's been such a rich discussion. So Anna, I'm going to start with you. Do you have any short final thoughts for us?
Well, I've really enjoyed listening to Matt and Sequoia. You know, it's some really good points made. I'm just really shocked at the people who are supposed to be progressive who are cheering on Trump's victory. I'm just absolutely horrified. You know that well, there's one lot who think that Harris should have won, and there's another lot of lefties who are saying, yay, Trump won, thank God, everything's going to change now. So it's like we've really got our work cut out for us.
Well said. Yes, I've had similar feelings to you as well. Over to you, Sequoia. What any last thoughts? Oh, I think you might be on mute.
Yeah, well, just to echo Anna, it's been a great first episode. I think these kind of initiatives are massively needed, particularly in the West, with unfortunately somewhat indoctrinated populations. And again, just to pick up on Anna's last point, I think it's perfectly reasonable and understandable to celebrate the loss of Harris while also not celebrating the Trump victory. And I think a lot of discussion here has shed light on why that's the case. Just to sort of quickly finish up, discuss the sort of balance of forces, if we like, and zoom out. I think Trump represents the mask off of the right-wing iteration of US imperialism. But the US, and with Trump at the helm, do pretty grotesque things. If you think about the votes at the UN, it's just one other thing we happen to not mention, but there are annual votes on, for example, the fundamental right to food, and the US and Israel votes against it. These things are just so almost basic, but they're worth reminding us of what we're dealing with. Another thing, just to say that Trump, as he often, or certainly presents his rationales as a kind of personal mission when he, for example, assassinated Soleimani, but it's just a point around killing leaders. If he thinks, or if he's portraying that as a route to victory, it's important for us to counter that, because anti-imperialist movements exist because of oppression. Killing the leaders won't kill the cause, won't kill the movement. So although I know I completely appreciate your ending point, it feels dire, almost Sisyphean, if you like, in nature. It is called the struggle for reasons, isn't it? To go with that old cliche. And just to sort of finish, I think it was Eduardo Galeano was trying to find the quote. He said, indignation must always be the answer to indignity. Reality is not destiny. And so even if the the status quo has a lot of obstacles. I think when you zoom out, we talked about BRICS, we talked about the shifting geopolitical and historical forces. I think there's lots of room for hope, and lots of it comes from the global south, but we can still exercise our responsibility in the West to, for example, when it comes to Palestine, support BDS, Palestine Action, and also very simple things: stay critically minded, educate, and speak to other people, and follow Empire Watch.
Definitely. And now, not often I will say this, but as it is a US election special, we're going to leave the final word to our American guest, Matt. Over to you.
Do you want a optimistic or a pessimistic final word? Because I can do both.
Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, maybe. I don't know.
I'm getting fireworks from Anna on my screen because you gave the thumbs up. So your thing behind you blew up. So we'll give it optimistic. I think what we're doing right here is what gives me hope, right? This idea with this technology we have here, we are spread around the world talking to each other as if we're just in each other's living rooms. Even 5 years ago, this would have been, we could have done it, but it might not have gone well. Right. So what we are dealing with in terms of the technology that we have and the ability to share information. And I think it was Sequoia, you brought up about how, every day on here we see videos and photos coming out of Gaza that, my God, and then we see them the next day. Right. Mm-hmm. So but this sharing of information, the ability of people to inform, the ability of people to coordinate and then organize and mobilize is unlike anything the world has ever seen. And the empire, the elites are terrified of this. This is why they want to ban TikTok. So this is what I come from as an American, is the fact that you have polls that are now months old, but show a clear American majority in favor of Palestine as opposed to Israel. Maybe it's not expressed that starkly, but when you look at public polling in the United States and you see that this was back in August or so, 55% of Americans say the United States military should not defend Israel. I mean, that's just astounding. That's absolutely astounding. When you have majorities of Americans supporting an arms embargo on Israel, simply astounding. How did this happen? Particularly when you have American politicians and the American corporate media basically just bleeding, parroting, trumpeting Israeli talking points. Yet you have the American public understanding the war, the genocide in Gaza for what it is, right? Understanding Israel and Palestine for what it is. And it's because of this type of independent media. And this is what gives me hope. And so I would just say to folks who are watching, certainly, support Empire Watch and support other organizations and individuals who are doing this type of work, because this is where we make a difference. And then we could do a follow-up in terms of how that difference is made, because certainly we barely touched upon, Anna brought it up briefly, but this idea of what's coming, particularly in terms of BRICS and some type of opposition to the American empire.
Excellent. Well, thanks all of you for your endorsements and recommendations as well. And just to say, if you would love to come back, then we would love to have you. If you like to come back, you don't have to love, but yeah, we'd love to have you all back on the show, because it's been, it's been really
You're like sort of in the fence, please.
Say that again, Rihanna.
Like, even if you're sort of on the fence about coming back, let's just try to pull you back anyway. And thank you for those hopeful. I have a perhaps silver lining thing about Trump, which I think Fiona might debunk, but maybe, like Sequoia said, it's a mask-off moment. When you can see your enemy coming, maybe it's a little bit. I'm hopeful that because Trump is so unpalatable to most people, and especially a lot of the mainstream neoliberal sort of factions, that maybe it'll be harder for them to unite behind him. And therefore, I'm just showing my Britishness that there's like a sort of like a divide and conquer sort of hope that Trump will not be able to unite everyone behind him. And when I say everyone, I mean like all the Western imperialists that we have to deal with. So that might be a hopeful note. But the counter to that is that they'll all unite behind him and just embrace the right way, racism full-heartedly. So now that I've left us all in a really happy place, Thank you all for coming on. And I interrupted Fiona, so do you want to continue with what you were saying?
I can't remember what I was saying, but I just think, you know, obviously we are facing really perilous times for humanity. Obviously, it's not like a cringy thing to say, but I mean, we really are. And I think, you know, it's important to tell the truth in that situation and to build the biggest possible movement, and understanding that actually all around the world there are billions of people that kind of have a similar aspiration for peace, for development, and for not this global war drive, which I think, unfortunately, despite the propaganda we're getting, is going to continue under Trump. And it's going to be really, really important to exploit any weaknesses that there are. If, you know, if people find Trump more unpalatable and that means we can build a bigger movement, then that's obviously an advantage. But I think we shouldn't be under any illusions as to what is coming our way. So with that in mind, please do like, subscribe, comment, share with your friends, because we need to beat this algorithm. If you want to support us financially, then you can become a member on our Patreon. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to have the last word, Lleana?
I know. I mean, I don't think I can bring it. Can I bring it down? I mean, because that's probably what's going to happen if I have the last word. No. Thank you again, everyone. This is our first ever live, and I actually think it went pretty well. I mean, I hope I'm not the only one thinking that. But yeah, thank you so much, Anna.
First of many, Lleana, yeah?
Hopefully.
We need to have some code word.
It's lovely chatting
We need to have
you.
some sort of code word to finish it.
Sorry?
Oh, thanks, Anna. No, I was just saying we should have some sort of code word to finish it, like over and out or something cringy like that. We'll have to work on that.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Take care, comrades.
See you next time.
Oh,
Bye,
bye.
everyone. Thank you.